Mainstream Mental Health Radio with Dr. John Huber.
What do you think you are, crazy or something? Well, you're not.
We're on a mission from God.
News, issues revolving around mental health. Dr. John Huber, a mental health professional for over 20 years, the chairman for Mainstream Mental Health, a clinical forensic psychologist, and a psychology professor at Texas State University. Breaking the silence of mental health, one day at a time, discussing the human condition, providing a sounding board for mental health issues, and making mental health mainstream.
You got a gift, my friend.
Now it's time for Mainstream Mental Health Radio.
Let the healing begin.
With Dr. John Huber. Listen to Mainstream Mental Health Radio with your host, Dr. John Huber. Check us out on social media, Google+, Mainstream Mental Health, Instagram at Mainstream Mental Health, Twitter at Mainstream MENTL, and search for Mainstream Mental Health on Facebook. Please tune in every week to Mainstream Mental Health Radio with your host, Dr. John Huber.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Mainstream Mental Health Radio Show. I'm your host, Dr. John Huber. And I want to remind everybody to check us out at mainstreammentalhealth.org. Remember to share our broadcasts and podcasts with your family and friends. You can find us at the Mental Health News Radio Network, or look us up on Blog Talk Radio, or just Google us at Mainstream Mental Health Radio, period. All right, today is an interesting topic, I find. It's something that I've studied and looked at and monitored for a large portion of my professional career. And we unfortunately get slammed with it a couple of times every year in the mainstream media, whether it's a school shooting or a church shooting, or unfortunately a business shooting where a disgruntled employee comes in and takes out their vengeance on the workplace. And it's a pretty scary thing to think. Right now we have Felix Nader. He's a security management consultant, and he is an expert on these types of things. We want to remind everybody that there are a couple of myths out there that a lot of people take, and although these types of violence workplace activities are extremely statistically rare, the fact is they are real. And if you take on these myths, one of them that workplace violence is not preventable, and the other one being that it will never happen here, you're setting yourself up. So with that, I'd like to introduce Felix Nader. And Felix, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dr. Huber, and I want to add one more myth that is a psychological inhibitor, and that is if it happens as opposed to getting ready for when it happens.
Exactly. Because it does. I mean, it wouldn't be in the news if it didn't.
Absolutely. And that whole notion...
All right, so...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. That's fine. Go ahead.
That whole notion of myths sets that mindset that it isn't going to happen. So since it's not going to happen, let's not invest and commit too many resources, because that could be money spent elsewhere until it happens, and then they're mandated or forced to do something, and it's too late kind of at that point.
Exactly. And it's a scary thing, and a lot of people try to hide from scary events or the potential of scary things, whether it's people who keep smoking cigarettes thinking, oh, I'll never get cancer. It's that same kind of mentality. Mm-hmm. And it is something that needs to be talked about, just like you need to talk about death and dying with your children. You know, what happens when I go? This is what I want to have happen. So we need to plan, and it puts us in a place of control as opposed to a place of reactivity, which is oftentimes a very bad place to be. So tell us a little bit about who you are, Felix, and what got you into security management.
Thank you. I'm a retired United States Postal Inspector, and I had two events in my life that got me involved to my current love. The first was the Public Information Officer in Washington, D.C. on August 20th, 1986, when Patrick Sherrill went postal at the Edmonton Post Office in Norman, Oklahoma.
I remember that.
Remember that? He killed and wounded.
I remember.
the employees, and that was an unfortunate circumstance because the Postal Service at that point was woefully unprepared to deal with that from a preventative measure and from the consequences that ensued. That was the first event as a postal inspector. And as you know, Dr. Huber, postal inspectors have both criminal and security responsibility for the Postal Service, its people, customers, and its vendors, et cetera, et cetera. And then I moved through that. As a consequence, I eventually got appointed as a workplace violence prevention inspector in the New York division and handled that assignment for 8 years, investigating hundreds of incidents, coordinating and collaborating with senior management on risk abatement measures, testifying at arbitration hearings, unemployment hearings, civil cases, criminal cases. I retired, and I had no intentions of doing anything when I retired in 2001. February 3rd, 2001 was a wonderful event in my life. And then we had September 11th. And September 11th came along, and the Postal Service said, we have nobody on Long Island doing workplace security at the level you did, Inspector Nader. Would you come back? And I said no. And eventually they convinced me, and that was 15 years ago, Dr. Huber, and I've been doing it ever since.
Wow. That is an interesting and amazing story, and in some ways kind of a sad story that you had to be brought back in for that. But the world is changing, and we need to move forward.
Absolutely.
So let's tackle the first one. Talk to me now about how, the first myth I talked about was workplace violence is not preventable.
Yes.
What are your takes on this, and what are the key things you look for?
Mass confusion is the justification for the survival and existence of that myth. Mass confusion in that they believe it's not preventable because they don't understand what workplace violence is. They look at workplace violence as someone who comes in with a gun or some individual who attacks an employee or person in the streets, so they label it not preventable. And the fact of the matter is, if you have an employee like we did in the military, and they should do in the civilian world, if you have an employee, there is no reason in the world why you should know as much as possible about that employee's life, their social life, their personal life, if you really care about that employee and you want to lead them as opposed to directing their ways. So it is preventable for the recognition of warning signs, risk factors, and then aggressive behavior associated to. And oftentimes the reason why they get caught with their pants down at their ankles is because they don't pay attention to the little things that contribute in a major way. And so they leave the responsibility of those issues to other people because they're so focused on the day-to-day activities, which is oftentimes productivity, performance, and getting the work done.
Well, I think that's accurate too.
Yes.
Well, I think that's important too, because what a lot of, especially the corporate entities that are out there, that's what they want. They want to see productivity, and unfortunately, a lot of them lose the fact that if you're engaged with your employees, they're going to be better employees for you, and they're going to be vested in it intrinsically as opposed to it's just a paycheck kind of thing. And that helps significantly, I think, with not even the violence, but also with satisfaction, workplace satisfaction.
Absolutely. And if they were connected to the real meaning and understanding of what prevention is, it would go right back to the statement you just made, Dr. Huber, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you have healthy, happy, satisfied employees, the likelihood of them trusting you with concerns are higher when they know you're going to follow through and alleviate and resolve their problems. But when there's no trust and confidence, they internalize their observations. They don't tell anybody, and even if it's their friend, they don't want to see their friend lose their job, so they don't bother to report.
Exactly.
And the production and the performance is impacted because people are doing less work.
Yeah, they're more worried about all those exterior stressors as opposed to what they should be when they're at work. And again, it's that family mentality. I mean, I work and have privileges at some hospitals, and there's one of the hospitals that you walk into, and it feels like a big family. In fact, the first year I was there, the nurse turnover was only 3%, and usually in the hospital industry, it's about 65%.
Yes.
There's a reason why it was about 3%. It was because everybody felt like family there. And it's changed now, and those nurses actually have become nurse practitioners. They felt so empowered from that environment. They went back and they've increased their value and their worth and moved on, and it's an amazing feeling to see that happen. So it's pretty crazy.
And that's an employee who gets it. That's an employee who understands that an organizational commitment is an organizational investment in those things that create a healthy, productive, coordinated workplace environment. The boss who is the typical get the job done represents that bully mentality that effectuates hostility in a toxic environment.
Exactly. It is very counterproductive. Now, as we talk about this, what are some of the best ways in your experience from this type of stuff to help in mentally calming down individuals when somebody comes to you and says, hey, this person kind of scares me. What's going on here? You're my boss. Help me out.
Yeah, that's typically the way it happens. And let me share with you typically the way it doesn't get resolved. Yeah.
Okay.
Go back to work. Right? Or the judgmental supervisor who says, that's Felix. You know how he is. Don't pay attention to him. He'll calm down. Or he hasn't taken his medication. Very insulting. He hasn't taken his medication yet. That's just the way he is. And so my focus when I get invited in, and I'm usually the third or fourth consultant that they call in because most of the time they believe the person that has this, and I'm not knocking anybody that goes and gets their PhD doctor as you have, but the employer tends to pay more weight to the person with the alphabet soup behind their names. And then a guy like me gets called in based upon referral of proven track record that has demonstrated the ability to communicate with people who need to be spoken to. Well,
there's no offense taken. Yeah, there's no offense taken because there's so many people in academia who've never done, and they have all these wonderful theories. And I see it every day in mental health. We got all these professors up in the ivory tower, and they're telling everybody this is how this is supposed to happen in therapy, but they've never had a therapy patient of their own. So,
my gosh. And so the workplaces that oftentimes miss the boat because they don't invest in training their supervisors. I say invest in your supervisors, engender that sense of trust, confidence, and commitment, and guess what happens? Then there's that spirit core you talked about at your hospital where there's a 3% turnover rate that encourages and promotes conversation, positive conversation. People feel empowered. They trust one another, and they're not afraid of saying, Felix has got a problem, and I'm going to help with the problem because I'm going to bring it to his attention and then take the hand and walk him into my boss to get the problem. But when you have zero tolerance, here's what zero tolerance does. It's a great legal construct because it protects the employer. But the coworker who sees his good friend having issues at home that reveal themselves in the workplace is not going to drop a dime on his coworker because guess what? His coworker has to be disciplined. So zero tolerance has an adverse effect that was intended to have a positive effect. It has to be better managed.
Well, again, I think that's ivory tower versus real life.
Yes, sir.
And it's unfortunate, but we have to look beyond that. And I think what I'm hearing you say, Mr. Nader, is that communication is the key. And if that's the case, that's what I've been doing, whether it's a marriage or a divorce or whatever. Communication is the key, and I really believe that myself.
No doubt. You could tell someone to an Irish joke I saw once on a letter carrier's lockers that said, the best way to tell someone to go to HELL is to tell them in such a way that they'll enjoy the trip there and back. And
that's right.
Right? And oftentimes the responsibility of the person in charge is to get the job done, and the result of the employee coworker who's having a conversation is to let the ego mandate the outcome as opposed to letting communication that is engendering good discourse effectuate the outcome. So workplace violence prevention is not necessarily a guy with a gun or an HR director that is going out to penalize. It's a concerted, coordinated effort by everybody in the organization that does what you do, but they do it throughout the business every single day.
Right. And that's best practice. I mean, that's the way it should be happening.
Yeah.
But, of course, you know, we get people who are trained in business or in computer programming, and they think, oh, I don't need to deal with that stuff. That's not what I do. Unfortunately, we're humans. And unfortunately, this last generation and the generations coming after this are essentially being dehumanized by all this social media where they never really learn to be social and they never learn to communicate appropriately because they're on tablets and on computers doing screen time instead of actually learning how to communicate and talk. So I think your job's not going away. My job's not going away. And in fact, the amount of work we do is probably increasing geometrically as we move forward.
No doubt. And to further exasperate that analogy is you get that the millennial in the workplace who might be that individual we described just now, who encounters a supervisor who is so prejudiced and so judgmental that the leadership goes by the wayside because the assumption is predicated on what's in front of him. Oh, you don't care, or you're not part of this,
right.
Or you're one of those. So the hostility and the toxicity starts right from perception.
Exactly. So we kind of moved into the second myth that, or the first myth. We're kind of going to that. We're getting ready, I think, to jump into. Well, it won't happen here. And what can you say about that?
That's huge because most policies are not supported by a plan or a procedure, and not even supported by training that is credible, that is based upon those policies and plans. It's not a perception in the hearts and minds of the employees that it's a serious commitment to their safety. So the reason why I described the differences between the if and the when, most policies are written by soft, evoked images of it won't ever happen here, so let's not focus on the when, let's talk about the if. And that whole psychological mindset of the if sedates the recipient of the information to believe since they don't care about it, why do we care about it? We will give it as much time and attention as they want us to give, and usually it's 30 to 45 minutes sitting in front of someone like me who may or may not know their material, or some internal resource who definitely doesn't know the material. And then the adult employee says, what a bunch of BS. They think that I take this seriously when they don't take it seriously? Who cares?
Or what's even worse, when it's a computer program that you have to flip through the PowerPoint all afternoon.
How insulting. As I said to a group today, how insulting. Who do you ask the question when you have a scenario situation you want an answer to, right? Who do you get? Who do you pull aside when you have a real life situation you're encountering and you want to ask, how do you resolve this? That is more of a litigious opportunity for a smart plaintiff attorney to come in and say, let me see the credibility of your training. Let me assess and evaluate what is it that you call credible training in the prevention of workplace violence. That's not credible. That is just checking a box and then saying it was done.
That's right. That is exactly right.
My opinion.
Yeah, no, and I think you're exactly right. And I was at a major university here in Texas until this past summer, and all their workplace violence, their EEOC, all the training was all done exactly that way. They'd make you sit down, you had to log in so that they had proof that you read their policies and procedures, and you had to flip through these PowerPoint presentations that did absolutely nothing and told you that it's not really that important to us, but we're doing this to cover our butt.
Absolutely. In my model, my violence and addiction model, I have a concept called RAP, robust, agile, and proactive. And within that model, there are three things that are essential, and that is responsibility, accountability, and consequences. Without all three, you can never have a credible workplace violence prevention program because the responsibility is part of the agility piece that creates ongoing. But the computer-based training only addresses accountability and consequences. They only care about protecting their rear ends, not about engendering an environment where people know what to do through empowerment.
Exactly. And that perpetuates these myths. You know, it's a pretty scary thing that they somehow feel empowered that they're doing the right thing when all they're doing is just keeping themselves vulnerable.
All the time, because they don't put the adults in an environment where even if someone of the experience that I purport to bring were to have a conversation with an adult, I would say, for example, here are a list of warning signs and risk factors. I would pause and I would watch the reaction on the faces of the employees because they're questioning themselves. Wait a minute. I went through a serious illness. I wasn't violent. I had a terrible divorce and my wife took me or my husband took me for every penny I was worth. I wasn't violent. I lost my dearly beloved father, mother, son. I didn't become violent. I have 4 kids in college and I'm finding a way to pay their tuition. So what are you talking about, Mr. Nader? Those warning signs are good. You know what's missing is the tangential association with aggressive behavior. If you see aggressive behavior, then the warning signs are significant. But without tangential aggression, you're just looking at a person that is just living those experiences, and nothing will ever happen because there's no indication of aggression, verbally or physically. And so
you're exactly right.
You know, Dr. Adults who are forced to be in this environment listening to a jerk like me, so to speak, convey this stuff without scenarios that help them understand how it impacts their safety and their security, there's no correlation to how it affects them.
Well, and I often get asked, for example, like the shooter in Florida, the Valentine's Day massacre. You know, I get, well, how come he saw these professionals in public school and he was, you know, referred for special ed and saw the counselors and how come, you know, there was nothing done at that point? And unfortunately, you know, the professionals in that industry are trained to be professionals for education. What can we do to overcome learning disabilities? Not to say, yeah, this guy scares me, let me do a risk assessment so I have an understanding of this guy's potential. That's a whole nother area, and there's no training going on in school systems for that.
Right. If my wife were here listening to you, she would say, oh, my God, my husband said on the first day of the press conferences by the superintendent and his minions, I hate to say that, and the sheriff, he said there was more to that is meeting the eye that's not being conveyed, and it was true. So Mr. Cruz, and the reason why there was no concern, even though they may have done all the things that they alleged to have done, the reason why there was no concern is because Mr. Cruz was no longer part of the school system. He had moved on.
At that point, yes.
At that point.
And that's what they were looking for.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they didn't look at
he was difficult.
Yes.
Right.
They weren't paying attention to the students who were receiving the information and the students who were acknowledging the existence of this problem, because guess what? And my 6 kids will tell you this, doctor, that most times teachers dismiss a student's complaint because they've got other things that are more important on their plate. Not because they don't care, but because they have things that are more important. And
we're not right. And it's like standardized tests, because those things, oh, well, that's good. You know, we can use that. And the politicians love standardized tests, but they're actually disruptive and destructive to the educational process. Whereas if teachers were teaching the kids and teaching them why they love history and the things that they found important in history versus what somebody in an office building in D.C. says needs to be taught so that everybody in the United States get this one level of training. You know, that's not what education is about, but it's what it's become. And the students and the teachers don't build those relationships. You know, when teachers are moving forward with an education, a program of training, and they're talking about things they love, those students find out that, hey, that teacher's a real human being, and they have family, they have needs and presses, and this is why they think it's important. The kids learn as much about the teacher as the teacher does about the students. And what's happened is nobody learns about either individual as a person anymore. It's all about the masses. Let's just go through, give them busy work, make sure they pass this standardized test, and we're good.
Very well said. And so I don't blame the teachers. I blame the institution.
Neither.
And the regulations that impose their will on this group of people who have invested themselves in helping students. And so they manage their classroom because that's all the time they have is to manage their classrooms with the mandated curriculum that does no teaching from the standpoint of creating and nurturing. And then we want them to be security guys to be able to manage the classroom, the hallways, the stairwell, and the playgrounds where all this stuff seems to erupt.
And I think if the teachers, if the teachers were teaching what they loved about their topics, they wouldn't need classroom management because it would happen on its own. The students would be engaged. They would go, oh, wow, that's cool. You know, teach them what entices them to become that math teacher, become the English teacher, the music teacher, the theater director, whatever it is. That creates its own intrinsic level of attention and concentration and focus, and students love that. Students don't want this artificial, you have to sit there and be still because this student up here doesn't get it and it's not going to pass this standardized test that I'm going to ultimately be judged on.
Right, exactly. And then as this student progresses through elementary school and high school and college and he goes to the workplace, they're going to encounter the same mentality of people who don't care because they were themselves raised through that process of not caring because we had no time for caring. You know,
that's right.
We just had time to do the things that were important, but no time for caring. And so the consequences of this stuff falls on deaf ears because the investment is not a commitment, and they consider paying $25,000, $50,000 to be a lot of money, when in reality it's a drop in the bucket.
It is, and unfortunately, you know, people don't see that. They see, wow, that's a lot of money. Well, it is as an individual, but when we're talking about institutions, governments, corporations, it's not. This world functions on a lot higher level than that because we're talking 330 million people in this country, and if everybody there is just making the median 48,000, however many dollars it is, you know, that is trillions of dollars. And people don't realize that.
No.
So,
and so
well, Felix, you know, go ahead, wrap it up.
I was going to say, in wrapping it up, going back to your question as to how do you overcome these myths, we have to make the training credible. We have to put people in seats that are excited about being there. We have to take a look at our own policies, plans, and procedures, assess and evaluate, and change them. And then we have to say, when something happens, let me bring in a guy to be able to teach this active shooter stuff that is realistic, that isn't just going to tell you what's going to happen to you, but it's going to prepare you to tell you what you need to do as an organization, as an employee, before you encounter that event, so you'll never get to that event. And when you do, you'll be prepared.
Exactly. Well, Felix, how can my listeners get a hold of you? How can they find out more about what you do? And how do they, if they want to maybe have you come and speak or talk to their corporation or business, how do they get a hold of you?
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Huber. I really appreciate that. I have a website that's designed to be informational, naterassociates.com, N-A-T-E-R with a T, associates.com. I have great material that you can peruse through my blog. I try to invite guests in, but it's all designed to educate, heighten awareness. And you can reach me for any time, anything you may need through my toll-free number at 877-825-8101. I did, until April 1st, maintain an office in Freeport, Long Island, but my partner and I decided that the rent was getting to be a little exorbitant, so we decided to operate out of our home offices. So now I operate out of my home office in North Carolina, but I am virtual. and I travel wherever the situation may arise. Don't look at prevention as an event that requires Dr. Huber or I after the fact. Look at prevention as a proactive intervention before there's a problem.
And that's what it is. Thank you so much, Felix Nader. And, hey, everybody, check him out. If you have any kind of influence in your business or you're thinking about starting your own business, it's a great resource. I've gone over his website myself, and I think it's very informative and probably the most simplified and informative place just to get information on workplace violence and what you can do about it. And it's a great starting point. Give him a call, and I'm sure he can help you out.
Thanks for listening to Mainstream Mental Health Radio with your host, Dr. John Huber. Check us out on social media, Google+, Mainstream Mental Health, Instagram @Mainstream Mental Health, Twitter @Mainstream MENTL, and search for Mainstream Mental Health on Facebook. Please tune in every week to Mainstream Mental Health Radio with your host, Dr. John Huber.